Now that we've talked about some basic security semantics, being able to support cross-origin sharing, requiring HTTPS so our communication front to back are nice and secure, let's talk about the sort of meat of the story, and that is doing authentication and authorization. The difference between these two is important, so I want to make sure everyone that's watching this really understands. Authentication simply means using a set of credentials to determine who someone is, what an identity is. So in the case of typical users, that could be simply a username and password. It could be credentials like a client certificate. It could be a set of credentials that prove where a call is coming from. So a server to server can also do authentication without having to mimic sort of a single user. Authentication isn't going to tell you what you're allowed to do. It's going to be the process of determining who you are. And that is used normally in authorization. And this is where it's going to take the identity that you've created in the credentials and determining whether you have right to a specific resource. So this user that I've identified with authentication, do they have rights to this particular API or this part of a website? With that in mind, we want to think about what do we really want to authenticate. So in some cases, we're going to be allowing developers to use our API in order to do things like build mobile apps or build tablet apps. And so we need to authenticate who the developers are, typically done with an app key and a secret. The secret is used for them to do encryption and us to do encryption and us to be able to compare the two. There's other cases where you're going to need to authenticate actual users of your system to determine who they are so that you can grant access to an API for those particular users. And it may be as simple as, is this a user or a super user or a manager or someone that has some particular set of roles? But sometimes you're going to have your API only be able to return data that is associated with that specific user. That's a very common case. This becomes important when you want to allow them to access user-specific data. Facebook is a good example of this. Once you authenticate as a user into a system, whenever you look at photos and friends lists and those sorts of things, you don't have to give them your user ID again because that authentication that's happened is telling them the context of what data you're allowed to see. In these cases, it's typically done with basic authentication, OAuth, or some sort of integrated authentication like Forms authentication in ASP.NET. So we're going to be walking through each of these scenarios to kind of talk about where you're going to do and how you're going to implement each of these kinds of authentication and authorization schemes.